Hello everyone, this is Derek with Reef Automation. This is episode 4 of the GHL Vs Apex series. In this episode we're going to go over the dashboard and the initial configurations that should be made on both the GHL and the Apex systems. So let's get started with GHL. So GHL, when you first get the dashboard, there's a number of things that you can do with it. If you hit the little paintbrush, you can move the dashboard tiles to different locations. You can also delete specific ones. You can also press the plus sign and add additional tiles if you wanted to, such as your dosing pumps, switch channels, KH director, for example. If you click on the little tic-tac-toe looking icon, you can change the row and column count. So for instance, if I only wanted to see 2 values here, I can go in here and say that I only want 1 row. So then now I have 1 row. I can also hit the paintbrush icon and enable and disable certain items on that list right here. So it's actually very intuitive to move and switch things around here in the dashboard. When you're done, you're going to want to hit the check mark up top. So another thing when you're using the dashboard is you're going to want to be able to enable and disable switches quite regularly, as that's one of the major features of using the dashboard. Now, on the GHL, they have an activate manual override right here, and that basically allows you to turn off and on and set the automatic programming to each channel. Once you hit that activate manual override, you can no longer control that outlet. So that's one thing I noticed. It's very similar to the Apex. Apex has something like that. Also, if you hit the little icon here, you can actually get into the setup right from here from a shortcut. And then you can, of course, change the programming. So again, if you go to your dashboard, I do notice that there's quite a delay when going through some of these things, which I find to be a little bit cumbersome. Depends on what you're trying to control, but when you're trying to control switch outlets and channels, sometimes you want to be pretty quick about it. I find it to be a little bit slow at times. If I hit the brush icon and I hit the brush icon here, I can actually enable and disable certain switch channels right there. So the ability in which to move things around and add and subtract things is quite nice on the GHL over the Apex, whereas in the Apex, which you'll notice later in this video, it's a little more cumbersome on the phone. I find it to be a little bit easier on the computer. Now, if you wanted to get into the more specific app settings, you're going to want to hit the 3 dots on the upper right-hand corner. You're going to get into the support, the knowledge base for help, and also your app settings. So there's a couple settings in here to take note. Here's your My GHL settings. So if you ever were to change your password, this is where you'd want to update it. This is also where you can enable expert mode for troubleshooting, which we're not going to do in this tutorial. You can also disable the auto lock, which means your phone is not going to auto lock while you're using it. This is useful if you have an iPad or an iPhone that is being used as your main display and you don't want it to lock after a period of time. So that's kind of neat. So let's go through some of the basic setups that you're going to want to do when you first get this guy going. So you hit the lines on the top there, and if you hit dashboard, that'll get you to your dashboard. You're going to want to go to general. That's going to be your first thing you want to do. Now, out of the box, it's set to German. So the recommendation here in the United States, of course, would be to set it to English. The key sound is just if you want to hear sounds as you click on things. This is where you're going to set the date and time. Now, one thing that I noted when I was setting the date and time is the time zone. The time zone's a little difficult. You have to go online and find out specifically what your time zone is. Now, again, this is only for if you want to do your automatic setting, so it automatically changes on daylight savings time, for instance. Now, here in Arizona, we don't have daylight savings time, so we actually have a special time zone. So it's going to be, I believe, +7, but again, I had to go online to find that out. And also you'll say change from winter standard time to summertime. That's your daylight savings time if you want to enable and disable that. For me, we don't have daylight savings time, so setting the local time and local date just from here, I don't have to mess with automatic setting. You could put your position. Now something I wish they had here was maybe a zip code, possibly. instead of a latitude and longitude, which again you have to go online to find out. This is if you don't want to have certain alarms during certain periods of the day. So it's a nice feature. The next one's pretty simple. This is the GHL Logo Illumination on the top of it. This basically will increase and decrease the brightness. You can also change what you want the color to be when there's no alarm. So for instance, I just want it to be standard without blinking. I don't like the blinking lights. You can also turn it off here if you wanted to. So the pin is basically if you want just a PIN code to get into the system instead of having to type in your username and password every time. I'm just going to use a username and password, so I'm not going to mess with that. When you're done with this, you want to make sure you hit save at the bottom. So that's the first thing I would take a look at. The next thing I would take a look at is your network. So we went over this in the previous episode, which just make sure that your web server has the password and the username that you want, and of course make sure that you're still connected to your unit. So next, the most important part of all monitoring systems would be your notifications. Now, both the GHL and the Apex provide you with notifications. However, the GHL and the Apex are quite different. On the GHL, it will support email notifications, and that is it. Now, one of the things to note on this is that when you go to email notifications, you must have an SMTP server. Whereas with the Apex, you do not need an SMTP server for it to send out emails. It does it through the cloud. The biggest difference between the two is the GHL requires an SMTP service such as GMX or SMTP2Go, and then it sends an email via the device, whereas again, the Apex sends it from the cloud. Now, the GHL doesn't support any push notifications, so the app's not going to send out any information. It also doesn't natively support any SMS messaging. So you would need to email an SMS message if you wanted to get text messaging, whereas the Apex automatically does that. So this is where you do that. This is where you're going to set up your email account information here. Once you get in here, you can add your recipient, your to subject. Now this is where you can send specific messages that you want. So if you want to get a specific message about reminders, a specific message about illumination, a specific message about alarm. I do like this feature. You can have the ability to set which specific message that you want to get. You can also have it always send depending on a specific time. You can have it only send when it's an alarm state. There's a lot of things you can do here. There's also a script and token, which we're not going to get into, which allows you to do advanced emails. So we'll hit cancel. We'll go back here. So after you're in email notification, you're probably going to want to take a look at a couple other things. My suggestion at this point would be to look at your switch channels, which are your outlets. And I would go ahead and set some of these up with the basic settings that you're going to want to use. For instance, I would go to my first outlet and I would set the name of it right here under description. And I would go through all of them and make sure that the name is what you want them to be for each thing. I'd then go back and I'd set the control sensors, and I'd go to each one of the sensors, make sure they're enabled, and make sure that they are also labeled. So we'll give this a second to connect here. All of the connections here are through my GHL, so they're a little bit slower than if you're connecting directly to the unit. You'll see I have a few of them already disabled. So again, I'd activate them, and then I'd put in the description, temperature, for instance, if you want it to be temperature or just temp, something that is easy to remember, because some of them, like redox for me, I would struggle to remember what redox is, so I might call that ORP. Conductivity I might call salt. Just easier labeling for myself. So that's the first things in the dashboard that I would do with your MyGHL and getting things kind of going. So let's move on to the Apex. Okay, so for the Apex, when we first get in there, you're going to see I have two different systems. Since I already have an Apex in my system, in my house here, we're going to be working with the Reef one, which is the one above. Now, what you'll first notice is there's a mine and an all. Now, those tabs allow you to see and view other people's systems if you wanted to. So typically I set mine to mine, but again, if you are someone that has multiple homes, multiple tanks, multiple friends, multiple accounts, for instance, you might want to set this to all so you can see all your accounts when you need to log into them. So in the lower right-hand corner is going to be just some real basic setups if you want to do Face ID, which GHL does not have and Apex does have, which basically allows you to log into your system via your Face ID, which I think is a great feature. GHL does not have that. You can also set up your appearance for dark or light or automatic, which will set the automatic or light dark system in the background. I have it set for automatic. You're not going to really do much else here, but you can sign out at the bottom if you needed to. So on the upper right hand corner, the three lines, if you click on your account, which mine is the Mariners, you're going to see I have my settings, link account, contact support, Apex Manual, Fusion Legal, just a couple things here. If you wanted to contact support, if you wanted to link an additional Apex, which is basically the same as the linking button in the upper left hand corner here. Another thing is if you go to settings, this is where you're going to get into the settings of your account. So Alexa, which we're not going to get into right now, we will do that later. So now if we hit display, you will see we have the ability to basically put a little cover over everything on your dashboard, which we'll show you in a few minutes. And this basically allows you to not click something by accident. In the GHL, they have a manual control override, which is very similar to this. But on the dashboard itself, this will allow you to turn it on, turn it off, or set it to auto mode. And if you want to cover over it so you don't accidentally do that, this is where you enable it. You can have it never on just touchscreen devices and on all devices. So for instance, if you use your computer, you might not want it to have it on the computer, but you might want to have it on the touchscreen. This is where you set if you have a 12-hour or 24-hour format. You're going to go then to your list and how you want to see your list. I usually set it to mine and expanded. That's usually the best way to do it. The next thing is measurement. This is very simple. If you do measurements or lab measurements inside the Apex system to basically log your measurements manually, this is where you'd set which test kits you use. Next thing is your notifications. Now, with Apex, you do not need an SMTP server. It's all automatic inside the unit. When you first set up your Apex Fusion system, it's going to automatically enable push notifications, which is what iOS means on the left here. You can disable it and enable it by the check mark. You can also test it, remove it here if you would like. You can also hit the plus symbol and add an email, SMS to the top and what your address is. Again, you do not need an SMTP server. So the difference between this and the GHL with the alerts is it's only going to alert you based on the email outlet, which we'll go over in the programming section of this episode series. Whereas at GHL, you can actually indicate each message and actually customize each message. Next one is if you want to change your password, which we're not going to do. The next thing is going to be your profile, which basically will tell you where the Apex is located, which we're also not going to do. And tours will basically give you some tutorials as you're going through everything, which is what I'm going to do for you. So if you click on your upper right hand corner lines, you go to home, you go to Apex list, it'll get you back here. Now one thing you'll notice is that there is a yellow icon on one of my Apex systems. What the yellow icon means is that there is an update available, and it will do the update via Apex Fusion, via the internet. Whereas with the GHL, you must hook up the GHL to a computer via USB and also hook it up with a Windows PC. It does not work with a Mac, so if you have a Mac, you cannot update the firmware on your GHL. Now, GHL has informed me that this will be something in the future, but it's currently not available. This also, if you want to enable support access, if you wanted Neptune to be able to log in and control your system, that's right here. You can also go into here and enable the voice control, which we're going to do in a different episode. You can adopt data from a different Apex. So GHL has data points that it uploads to the cloud. Same thing with the Apex, so you can actually adopt it from a different Apex if you wanted to. So we're going to click on the reef. That's going to get us into the Apex, and you can see what I really like about the Apex right as you log in is everything is labeled salt, ORP, pH, temp. Very easy to understand. So similar to GHL, you can get into all the programming of each of these guys by hitting the little gear icon that's next to them. What's really nice about the Apex is if you hit the salinity level, it'll show you a graph. And you can see how quick that graph comes up. And you can manipulate the graph, see what it was. Again, we haven't plugged in any of the probes, so it's going to be pretty much the same all the time. But this is where you can get into the graphs very easily on all of the devices just by hitting the graph itself or hitting the ORP, for instance, hitting the pH. Now, if you go on the graph itself, you can scroll and it will show you the day and time for 24 hours of a graph time, which I think is really intuitive. Furthermore, if you go into anything here, it's going to give you some values such as your wattage per use on each outlet right here on the display, which is really easy to go through. You can see your amps throughout the day, you can see your voltage throughout the day. Very intuitive, very easy to use, and I might add it's very quick. Another thing that we need to discuss is the outlets are enabled by default, as I mentioned in previous episode. However, what I didn't mention is that the outlets are actually programmed as well. So for instance, outlet 4 is programmed for the heater already. So if you're not familiar with programming at all, this is already done for you. So that's why the outlet is already on, because it's already programmed for a heater. So if we go back, and that's going to be the small, looks like a dashboard icon, which this is the dashboard. So we got a skimmer already programmed, we got a fan already programmed, there's already things already programmed. There's also the email/alarm already programmed, which again, we're going to go over these in detail as we get to the programming section of the episodes. This is where you turn on and off your feed cycles. This is where you can log the measurements as we talked. They also have a notes and reminders section, which again is very similar to that of the GHL. Now you'll notice that there are those little slide covers. What you're going to want to do is just take your finger and go across them if you want to enable and disable. Otherwise, it will not let you control anything, which is what is the whole point of it, is to basically make it so if I click on this, nothing will happen until I slide over these. A feature at the top is there is a button right here which lets you actually uncover all of them all at once if you needed to. So the lock button, if you click on the lock, this will allow you to move things around in the dashboard. Now, one thing that I am not too keen on with the Apex dashboard is this sliding ability to add things. Now, if you have a lot of things, this can be rather cumbersome to get to. And then what you do is you drag it and bring it over here. You'll notice there's an X, which lets it basically disappear. The other thing that I notice, again, is that if you have a lot of things, there's not an ability to decrease or add maybe like a table or possibly a drop down for each item. Each item is separate and each item has to be moved separately. On an iPhone, it's quite difficult. On an iPad, it's a lot easier. And on a computer, it's extremely easy. So if you're using a phone, I find that moving the dashboard is a little bit tricky with the Apex. So you'll hit the lock button to get everything locked back up. You can't move anything. You can't do anything while it's locked back up. A couple small settings that we're going to want to look at. If you click on the upper right hand corner here and you click on your unit, if you go down to heartbeat and clock, that's where you're going to want to take a look at. Clock, what I like about the clock here is that there is a small compass icon that will get your location. If you click on that, you can actually set your location, which I think is really quite good in comparison to the GHL, because this will actually set your time zone automatically without having to know your time zone. You can enable and disable daylight savings time here. So that's clock. If we click on this again and we go down to heartbeat, this is another feature that I really like about the Apex. If your Apex was to lose connectivity whatsoever, depending on network connectivity, power connectivity, if this thing was to get flooded, if this thing was to drop in a lake, it won't matter. It's going to send you an alert to tell you, hey, your Apex is offline. You're going to want to enable this immediately when you get your heartbeat. Now, I say immediately, however, you have to wait for your unit to be on for at least a day before you can do this. So once it's been linked for a day, you can come up here and hit enabled. Right now we can't because my unit's only been up for less than a day. So that's Heartbeat. I highly recommend it. It's one thing that I noticed GHL does not have. They possibly might have it in the future, but currently they do not have it. If you go to Miscellaneous, this is where you will put your feed time and how long each feed cycle will go. This is where you would data log if you want to log data on the cloud longer or shorter amounts of time. This is where you hit the sounds. These are the sounds that come out of the Apex display, which is not included with this kit. So if you have a display, which we'll go over later, you can actually have alarms come out of it. This is also where you enable and disable power monitoring, which will also be something in an upcoming episode. We go back to Reef and we go back down to network. This is where you can enable and disable your Wi-Fi, change your Wi-Fi. You can also update your Wi-Fi address here and your host name. This is also where you can update the firmware as well if you wanted a different way of doing it. This is where you can set up the IP address of your unit if you needed to change it. So that's all under there. So that's basically the basics of getting your Apex up and running, and when you first get it started, this is what you're going to see. So hopefully you liked this video and you were able to take a look at what the Apex and the GHL look like when you first get them going. In the next coming videos, we're going to go over some programming techniques and advanced setup for both of the systems. In our next episode, we're going to go over calibrating probes. If you want to take a look at all the rest of the episodes, they're right here. And please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.